Gopi Janavalabha Giri Bharadari. Yasoda Nandana Braja Janaranjana Yamunatira Banachari Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Prabhupada, Prabhupada Jaya, Prabhupada Jaya, Prabhupada. Prabhupada, Prabhupada, Prabhupada. Jaya Prabhupada. Jaya Om Vishnupad Paramhamsa Paravajakacharya To Taratata Shri Śrimad Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Grantaraj Śrimad Bhāgavatam Ki Sam Veda Bhakta Vrinda Ki Gaur Premananda. All glories to Assembled Devotees. All glories to Assembled Devotees. All glories to Assembled Devotees. All glories to Sri Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. Could you push that camera just a little, just same angle, everything, just push it closer to me. Keep pushing it a little further. Yeah, okay, now that got twisted in the process. Move it, rotate it. Yeah. Yeah, that's right there. Yeah, that's good. We're going to let that be. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Gananjana Shalakhaya Chakshur Anmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Shtapitam yena bhutale swayam rupa kadamhayam Didati swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Pada Kamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavam Cha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathan Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhunam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakanvitam Cha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavan Eshvari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Okay, so we are on Canto 3, Chapter 25, Text 18. Jnana Vairagya Yuktena Jnana Vairagya Yuktena Bhakti Yuktena Chatmanam Bhakti Yuktena Chatmanam Pare Pasyati Udasinam Pare Pasyati Udasinam Prakritim Cha Hataujasam Prakritim Cha Hataujasam Jnana Vairagya Yuktena Bhakti Yuktena Chatmana Paripasyati Udasinam Prakritim Cha Hataujasam. Jnana Vairagya Yuktena Bhakti Yuktena Chatmana Paripasyati Udasinam Prakritim Cha Hataujasam. Anybody else? Jnana Vairagya Yuktena Bhakti Yuktena Chatmana Paripasyati Dasinam Prakritim Cha Hataujasam. Jnana Vairagya Yuktena Bhakti Yuktena Chatmana Paripasyati Dasinam Prakritim Cha Hataujasam. Vaishnavis. Jnana Vairagya Yuktena Bhakti Yuktena Chatmana Paripasyati Dasinam Prakritim cha hataujasam jnanam, knowledge. Vairagya, renunciation. Yuktena, equipped with. Bhakti, devotional service. Yuktena, equipped with. Cha, and. Atmana, by the mind. Paripasyati, one sees. Udasinam, indifferent. Prakritim, material existence. Cha, and. Hata ojasam, reduced in strength. So the translation reads, in that position of self-realization, by practice of knowledge and renunciation in devotional service, one sees everything in the right perspective. He becomes indifferent to material existence, and material influence acts less powerfully upon him. So we can chant this together. In that position of self-realization, by practice of knowledge and renunciation, in devotional service, one sees everything in the right perspective. He becomes indifferent to material existence, and material influence acts less powerfully upon him. So here is Prabhupada's purport. As the contamination of germs of a particular disease can influence a weaker person, similarly, the influence of material nature or illusory energy can act on the weaker or conditioned soul, but not on the liberated soul. Self-realization is the position of the liberated state. One understands his constitutional position by knowledge and vairagya, renunciation. Without knowledge, one cannot have realization. The realization that one is the infinitesimal part and parcel of the Supreme makes him unattached to material conditional life. That is the beginning of devotional service. Unless one is liberated from material contamination, one cannot engage himself in devotional service of the Lord. In this verse, therefore, it is stated, jnana vairagya yuktena, when one is in full knowledge of one's constitutional position and is in the renounced order of life, detached from material attraction. Then, by pure devotional service, bhakti yuktena, he can engage himself as a loving servant of the Lord. Paripasyati means that he can see everything in the right perspective. Then the influence of material nature becomes almost nil. This is confirmed in Bhagavad Gita. Brahma bhuta prasanatma. That's Bhagavad Gita, 18th chapter, verse 54. When one is self-realized, he becomes happy and free from the influence of material nature. And at that time, he is freed from lamentation and hankering. The Lord states that position as mad bhaktim labhate param. The real state of beginning devotional service. Similarly, it's confirmed in the Narada Pancharatra that when the senses are purified, they can then be engaged in devotional service of the Lord. One who is attached to the material contamination cannot be a devotee. Jnana vairagya yuktena bhakti yuktena chatmana paripasyatu dasina prakritim cha hataujasam. In that position of self-realization, by practice of knowledge and renunciation in devotional service, one sees everything in the right perspective. He becomes indifferent to material existence, and the material influence acts less powerfully upon him. We're in the second section of this particular chapter, where we're finding out how Kapila introduces the Sankhya Yoga philosophy system. So from verses 1 through 11, Devahuti inquired from Kapila, but now 12 through 20, so we've got a couple of verses left in this section. Kapila begins to introduce Sankhya. Now, of course, we may ask, what exactly is Sankhya? We've kind of discussed that. But we keep coming back around to the same point that I really want to emphasize very strongly. When we talk about Krishna consciousness, we are talking about a system of philosophy, and we're talking about practical activities that are part of that system of philosophy. Now, in describing that system of philosophy, we are talking about many hidden and mysterious aspects of the world, aspects that most people don't see, don't know, don't understand. So, in books like Bhagavad Gita, Śrimad, Bhāgavatam, and other devotional literatures, we learn how to understand and see in proper perspective this unseen world that most people don't see, most people don't know about. We learn how to understand it. And we do that through metaphoric language, or through various kinds of analogies, metaphors, and sometimes technical words that are defined in a particular way. So, as a person begins to understand Krishna consciousness, they begin to see that the Śrimad Bhāgavatam, with its 18,000 verses, is not saying something different from Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavad Gita is not saying something different from Nectar of Instruction or Nectar of Devotion or Ishopanishad. They're saying basically the same things, but they may approach it from a slightly different metaphor. And what I find striking so far in this chapter, chapter 25 of third canto, is how when Kapila starts explaining this yoga system, this Sankhya Yoga, right away we start hearing these various different metaphors. And it's important to realize that these are all discussing basically the same thing, but in slightly different language with slightly different sort of visual models, if you want to think of it that way, a way to visualize what's being said. So what kind of things have we been hearing about so far? We've heard about this Sankhya Yoga is about mind control. One needs to control the mind. In Bhagavad Gita, we hear about a yogi. What do yogis do? Yogi is supposed to be known by someone who controls the mind. Now, sometimes yogis are described not to control the mind, but control the senses. But since the mind controls the senses, those two things are almost the same thing. So, controlling the mind or controlling the senses is one way to talk about Krishna consciousness. We can talk about purification of the senses. That's a different metaphor. We're purifying the senses. Now, what does it mean to purify the senses? It means to redirect them towards Krishna, redirect them towards Krishna. And by doing that, the original senses come in contact with the original sense object, which is Krishna, instead of the material senses coming in contact with material sense objects for material purposes. So if we continue to redirect the senses towards Krishna, eventually we will fully connect with Krishna, and we won't be strayed by connecting with the external sense, connecting the external sense objects to the senses and thinking that's the goal of life. So it's a little bit different than controlling. In one sense, we're controlling the senses or controlling the mind, but it's a little bit of a different way of looking at it. So we've heard that explanation. And then we earlier heard about it being freedom from the modes. Now here's another different metaphor, the modes of nature. We have goodness, passion, and ignorance. And we learn that our entire material world, everything that we're swimming in every day, is pushed around by the modes of nature. And sometimes the mode of passion is prominent, sometimes the mode of ignorance is prominent, and sometimes the mode of goodness is prominent. And therefore, like a person going out into the weather, sometimes the weather is nice, sometimes the weather is bad, sometimes the weather is really rotten. You know, there's a whole storm going on. So similarly, we have modes outside, we're experiencing them, and we have modes internally as well. Most people wind up just equalizing the modes. Whatever's going on outside just becomes what's going on inside. If outside people are acting crazy, outside people are acting lustfully and in all kinds of reprehensible ways, they assume, well, that must be what we do here, so I'll get into it, you know. So this is internalizing the external modes. But we learn that we don't necessarily have to mirror the external modes internally. We can be different from those modes. We can be placed in a mode of ignorance environment and not become mode of ignorance ourselves. Now, to do that requires, you know, spiritual prowess or spiritual cultivation. It won't happen automatically. It can happen, but it requires cultivation. So that's another way of talking about Krishna consciousness, is we learn how to keep the mode of goodness within, regardless of what's going on outside, you know. So like a person in a rainstorm, you don't have to get soaking wet. You can have an umbrella and you're walking in the rain, but you're not soaking wet. Everybody else that didn't bring an umbrella is, but not you, you know. So you can be saved from the weather that way. So this was described a couple of verses ago. In fact, I think I gave class on that. It was verse 15 or something. We talked about how being under the modes of nature is indicative of a person being in material consciousness. So what we're doing is we're contrasting material consciousness and spiritual consciousness. Those two things are being contrasted. Now, we also sometimes describe Krishna consciousness as attachment to Krishna. And sometimes we describe Krishna consciousness as detachment from matter. And those two things are the same thing. So if one is attached to Krishna, one will be detached from matter. If one is attached to matter, one will be detached from Krishna. It's just as simple as that. And usually most of us are somewhere in between on that spectrum. To some extent we're attached to Krishna, to some extent we're attached to matter. And so we learn how to change that ratio. And so sometimes in this explanation of Sankhya Yoga, sometimes in this explanation of Sankhya Yoga, we hear about attachment to Krishna and we hear about detachment from matter. And sometimes we hear specifically about being detached from the body. We always talk about we are not this body. That's a common theme that comes up. It's all through Bhagavad Gita. Prabhupada says it many, many times. And it's coming up here in the Sankhya explanation that we are not matter, we are spirit. And so not only are we, as we just mentioned, detached from sense objects, we're also trying to cultivate an understanding that we are not this vessel that we sit in. You know, we have legs, arms, eyes, body, mouth, insides, you know, various, we have the alimentary canal, we eat, we breathe, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So we are in the body, but we are not the body. But a person who is progressive in Krishna consciousness has not only that jnana, but he has the vairagya to go with it, you know. So here in this verse we hear jnana and vairagya, jnana and vairagya. Through knowledge, one gets detachment. And sometimes we hear from knowledge we get realized knowledge, knowledge or jnana and vijnana. So sometimes we see jnana and vairagya, and sometimes we see jnana and vijnana. Vijnana is realized knowledge. One hears that I'm not this body, but one day we actually become detached from the body, and we see that it's not just an idea, it's true. Of course, the day we die, we'll get an expert lesson in we're not this body, because we won't be able to hold on to it anymore. At that point, if we had any doubt that we were not the body, that doubt will be completely dispelled. But of course, for most people, that'll be too late, because they'll realize the body's gone, but they're not. So the body's no longer here, but I'm still here. Therefore, I must not have been the body all this time. But I sure thought I was. And so many cultures, the departed spirit or subtle body still hovers around where the body is. That's why when you go to graveyards, there's so many ghosts there, because they are still attached to that thing which has now been in a box underneath the ground for many, many years. They still hover around it. And that's why in the Vedic system, usually the body is burned, because then there's nothing for that ghost to cling on to. It's gone, completely gone, nothing left of it. And therefore the ghost can kind of think, well, at least this is over with here. I've got to move on to something else. So we are not the body. So this is also the way that Sankhya is being presented, both by, you know, Kapila and by Prabhupada when he's explaining in the purports. So we're detached from the body. We become free from happiness and distress. So this is being emphasized. We heard that very recently. Was it in last 3 days we've had just lectures on Balaram. So, but I think the last couple of verses ago, yeah, becomes in verse, can't see the numbers here, 16. It says one transcends so-called material happiness and distress. So how do we transcend happiness and distress? We grow up, we come out of the womb. When we grow up, we are always looking for what feels good and what doesn't. And so every moment of the day, we're racking up our table. This feels good, this doesn't feel good. This feels good, this doesn't feel good. And therefore, we make this huge long list of things that feel good and things that don't feel good. And our whole life is about increasing our connection with and our time spent in things that feel good and decreasing it in things that feel bad. And, you know, that's kind of naturally the way humans work. However, if a person has only that one benchmark or that one measure stick by which one judges everything, such a life will be a worthless life, because it's just drifting from one thing that feels good, trying to get another thing that feels good. Of course, one thing you recognize right away is no matter how much you try to increase and hold on to things that feel good and get rid of things that don't feel good, life somehow magically forces you through many situations which don't feel good. And there's nothing you can do about it. Try as you may. You're still forced through them. But when a person becomes spiritually advanced, when one understands Sankhya Yoga, then we become detached from it. We see that right now maybe some things are not the way I wish they were, but it's okay. I'll live with it. Now, maybe some things are very, very wonderful. My senses are very happy right now. But I know soon enough that'll go away. So we become less focused on this, making tables of what we like, what we don't like, and how we're going to get more of what we like, and how we're going to get rid of things we don't like. So this is another way that we see Krishna consciousness described. So rising above happiness and distress, harsha shoka, or you know, we're finding out that one is free from sukha and dukkha. So sukha is pleasure and dukkha is displeasure. So we learn how to become detached from that. And it doesn't necessarily require some kind of special yoga technique. It just requires focusing on Krishna. The more we focus on Krishna, the less we focus on what's going on with our material body right now and how it feels. We all have heard the stories about how in a football game, someone is thrown the ball and they run with the ball and they dive across the end goal and they make the point. They make the points from scoring. And then they realize their leg was broken. So a person was so focused on making the point for the team, they didn't even recognize the fact that their leg was broken when they were trying to get across the line. So this kind of thing happens. People completely disidentify, even in normal material life, because of a particular materialistic goal. It's so keen in their mind, they may disidentify with even some serious problem in their body that they only recognize afterwards. So this shows that if a person really continually thinks about the Supreme Lord, then what's going on with the body, it's there, but it's not such a big thing. So this is also a part of this whole idea of Sankhya Yoga. So we hear about engaging the senses in Krishna. We were talking about that already. Or seeing oneself as a fragment. So Krishna is there, we're here. Krishna is everything, but we are not everything. We are something, but we don't extend forever. We're just a tiny location. And I see things from my perspective, and you see things from your perspective. But Krishna sees things from every perspective. And when we realize we're a tiny fragment, then it makes sense that if we're part of a larger thing, we have some relationship with the larger thing. And then we learn from Bhakti system that that relationship is service. And we try to do that. And then we learn also that because of many lifetimes of ignoring our capacity to serve, we don't find service so comfortable or natural. We find it kind of difficult and clumsy, and sometimes we have to bring ourselves to it over and over again when we're not naturally inclined. So this is another way to think about Krishna consciousness. So we're going through these various things, and we see that the elements we're hearing about are all parts of the Sankhya system, and they're all parts of basic Krishna consciousness. And they're different ways of expressing the same reality, that Krishna's great, he's the controller, we're small, we're the servant, we're trying to serve Krishna, we're having trouble with that, but if we continue, we will come out all right. We will be able to serve Krishna nicely, more and more nicely as we continue with Krishna consciousness and spiritual life. So, Prabhupada, in this verse, he talks about the Brahma-bhuta platform. So, what is the Brahma-bhuta platform? He quotes the 18th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, which is Brahma-bhuta prasanatmana sokchati nakanchati sarvas sama sarveshu bhuteshu mad bhaktim labate param. One who is transcendently situated at once realizes the supreme Brahman and becomes fully joyful. He never laments or desires to have anything. He's equally disposed toward every living entity. In that state, he attains pure devotional service unto me. So, the Brahma-bhuta platform, Prabhupada explains that it's not the highest platform, it's the platform where you start. So, Brahma-bhuta means that you are above the three modes of nature. Brahma-bhuta means that you are recognizing you're not this body. You are equal or even to all people, all living entities. But you haven't actually fully cultivated service yet. But when you cultivate service, you go beyond the Brahma-bhuta platform. And but when one is already on the Brahma-bhuta platform, one doesn't hanker or lament. Na sokshati, na kankshati. So how do we get free from hankering and lamenting? We come to the Brahma-bhuta platform. We do that by service. So that's our bridge, the way we connect to the Brahma-bhuta platform. And so Kapila will talk about the Brahma-bhuta platform. And Krishna talks about the Brahma-bhuta platform in Bhagavad Gita. So we have this same concept that we learn that a person who is spiritually advanced doesn't hanker, doesn't lament, doesn't focus on material things. He's equal to all, pandita samadarshana. We hear all these kind of things. And these are qualities we can notice if we have or we don't have. And by engaging in Krishna consciousness, then we gradually make progress. So, that kind of caps off the main part of what I was going to try to say. But I wanted to talk about another point that I thought was very important that seems to have come up a lot in the last couple of weeks. And that's this point of Prabhupada narrating the transcendental literatures. That Prabhupada, of course, he gave us a legacy of an enormous quantity of books, a quantity of books that really doesn't have any parallel. If you look at the Gaudiya Math even, you know, nobody translated that many books. And what's important is that he translated all the books in a single sort of siddhanta, in a single sort of exegesis. There's a cohesion to it. It's not that different people translated it and this person had this view and this person had some other view, et cetera, et cetera. He pulls it all together. And if you read Bhagavad Gita or you read Bhāgavatam or you read CC or whatever it is, you're going to see essentially the same philosophy as we've been just talking about, how it's using different words. But it's fine, I think, to think that Krishna dictated every word to Prabhupada exactly the way it needed to be. And, you know, I don't have any necessary gripe or contest with that. But in the larger view of things, it does make a difference to kind of see things in perspective, that we need to see things in perspective. Otherwise, sometimes something important gets lost. Now, what could possibly be getting lost in seeing that every word that Prabhupada said was perfect exactly the way, and that his books are the law books for the next 10,000 years? I think they are, but I don't think what that means is that every word, the way Prabhupada translated it, is going to stay on the same page, the same way, for the next 10,000 years. Now, what I'm getting at here is that it's nice, and it's important, actually, to see the important legacy that Prabhupada left us with the transcendental literatures. There's no way that can be underestimated, and it is a fact, and I've noticed it many times. Prabhupada did have a way with the English language. It was not his first language, but he did have a way with the English language that got across very complex and sometimes confusing points in a fairly simple and straightforward way that even dull-headed people could grasp what he was talking about. There's no doubt about that. But the point that I'm getting around to, that I want to make, which I think is an important point, is that sometimes when people make this claim that everything is going to remain exactly the same way for the next 10,000 years or for all eternity or whatever, there's something they're not actually taking into consideration. And what is that they're not taking into consideration? Well, for one, Prabhupada had editors, which meant that when he first wrote the Bhāgavatam, it wasn't normal English, you know. So, and it wasn't that Prabhupada said, you know, well, if these words are all coming from Krishna, no one should ever touch them. In fact, it was Prabhupada who found editors and asked them to put it nicely, to look through the books and find where there were ungrammatical things or things that were not standard English. And so the editors had the job of working their way through what Prabhupada had said and finding where it could have been said maybe in an easier way or was less confusing in some way or another. And then we have another aspect of what's going on, and that is that when Prabhupada originally began to translate Bhagavad Gita and Śrimad Bhāgavatam, how did he do it? He spoke into a dictaphone. And he would turn the dictaphone on, he would turn it off, and there would be someone who would type what Prabhupada said. And after it was typed, there would be someone who would typeset it, which, you know, now it's all done by computers, but at one point that wasn't the way it worked. And so between what Prabhupada said and what wound up on the page on Bhagavad Gita, sometimes there were slip-ups. Not just sometimes. There were a lot of slip-ups. And so in the early days, when people read Bhagavad Gita, or they read Bhāgavatam, they would call in to the BBT and say, on page so-and-so in Śrimad Bhāgavatam in third canto it says this, is that really right, or is that a typographical error? And the BBT would look at it and say, yeah, I think you're right. That's a typographical error. We'll fix it. And each time the BBT printed a new set of Bhagavatams, they would fix things that had been wrong before. And, in Bhagavad Gita, there were a whole bunch of things, Jayadvaita Swami had this thing that he published at one time, some time ago, called Responsible Publishing. I've got a whole box of these, actually, he gave me at one point. But what it talks about is, if you're really careful and you read Bhagavad Gita and you go through different versions of Bhagavad Gita, you will notice that some verses are not the same as other verses in an earlier version of it. And so in earlier versions of Bhagavad Gita, we have the famous, this realization is made by working with the fruit of being fixed in the supreme realization of the absolute self, something that sounds really profound but means nothing. It's just, it's not even a regular English sentence. It's got problems. There's no verb in it, really. It's got a gerund that's doing a double take as a verb and a noun, So then there was the famous thing about the demigods and the demons take a sea cruise, which, when did the demigods and the demons take a sea cruise? That was a mistake. Somebody hit the wrong key on the typewriter, and people just thought, cool, the demigods and the demons are taking a sea cruise. And then there's the famous Planet of the Trees, that was in the earlier version of the Bhagavatam, that the demigods went to the planet of the trees, but it's actually supposed to be the planet of the pit trees, So, these things are kind of laughable and they're funny, but they were in Bhagavad Gita. They were really in Bhagavad Gita. So these things kept cropping up, and eventually the idea was to go through the whole thing and just remove as many of these as we could find and kind of have a version that we would be good with. And this all makes sense. But when it actually happened, there was a great furor that broke loose, that how dare they change the Bhagavad Gita. And today you will hear devotees talk exactly like this. There's a group of devotees who believe that because typographical errors were taken out, that the Bhagavad Gita was changed. So Prabhupada really did mean the planet of the trees, or he really did mean that the demigods took a sea cruise, or these kind of things, because Prabhupada said them. But if you look at the original manuscript, that's not in what Prabhupada originally said. It's much more oblique than that. So that's the nature of what an editor does. An editor tries to understand what the author originally intended and to see if something has come between what the author originally wanted to put and what wound up on the paper. And so there are some people who believe that, Prabhupada said everything perfectly, and probably more often than not he did, but sometimes in between what Prabhupada spoke into a dictaphone and what wound up on the page, there is something different going on there. And so there's this tendency to not only just disparage, but even demonize the people who are doing this editing work. That how dare they think they know more than Prabhupada, they changed his words. Well, why did Prabhupada ask for editors anyways in the very beginning? What was the point in it? If his words were perfect exactly the way they were, just leave them in the kind of Indian English that Prabhupada spoke. But it was Prabhupada himself that asked for that to be worked on, to be changed. So another thing that I think most people don't realize is that languages change. Even if we froze the Bhagavad Gita, we froze the Bhāgavatam, and we froze all of Prabhupada's literatures exactly the way they are now. In not too many years, it's not going to mean much to most people because things change. We say for the next 10,000 years, but we look at 5,000 years ago, who was speaking English? They were speaking Sanskrit. Prabhupada had to translate it from that Sanskrit into English. So that's just 5,000 years. We're talking about 10,000 years in the future. What language are they going to be speaking then? Now, we can think magically, and that Krishna is going to just make a miracle and the English language will never change. But Krishna created time. Krishna created the universe. He created the English language, and he knows how to speak it better than anyone. So Krishna did all these things, and probably, likely, Krishna's going to let English do what it's done all along. And not only English, every language does this. You know, sometimes I just use this for a point of reference. This is, I can pass this out. You know, you can, I didn't have time to set up a PowerPoint or something like that, but you can take a look at that. And anybody have any idea what this actually says, you know? This language, what's that? No, this language is English. But, yeah, right. Give one to, this is English, but it's Chaucerian English. This is what English looked like and what it sounded like in the 14th century, you know, about 140 years before Lord Chaitanya. This is just 700 years ago or something like that. So you can see how, you know, how much the language has changed. Now, are we going to believe that English is not going to change from this point onward? I mean, every language changes. French changes, German changes, Sanskrit changed into Bengali and Gujarati and a number of other languages. So every language changes. So at some time in the future, someone's going to have to go through Prabhupada's books and update them towards the language that people are actually speaking in the future. So the Christians had to do that with the Bible. You know, that the Bible was full of these and thous and forsooth and, you know, all these kind of antique and antiquated phrases that now don't mean anything to the modern mind, you know. So this is the idea. What Prabhupada gave us was a hermeneutic or a siddhanta, and he gave us one view of the entirety of bhakti, which was bigger than anybody else had ever done. You know, no one else had gone through the main books of the Vaishnava tradition and in a single voice, in a single way, put them into a, like a collection. So Prabhupada translated, 60 books or something like that. And you can see that there's a consistency there. And what we need to do is preserve that consistency. But we aren't going to be able to do that simply by locking words on a page and making sure that no word ever gets changed. And then what will happen in 10,000 years or even in 500 years if people believe there's a planet of the trees, or people believe that the demigods took a sea cruise, or that there's, you know, Jayadvaita Swami has a whole list of them here, of various bloopers that, why were there bloopers to begin with? Because they were trying to publish Bhagavad Gita and Bhagavatam as quickly as they could. And that necessarily meant that there were mistakes in the Chaitanya Charitamrita as well. So the job of editors was to go back over it, make sure that it's actually presenting our philosophy. And as things move into the future, we're going to see that the language will need to be updated as well, at least at some point, you know. If we know what our philosophy is now, and just as devotees can read it and understand it and see how it relates to itself, how it's consistent, self-consistent, then they'll be able to do that. But if devotees demand that everything remains on the page exactly the way it was in 1975, you know, then what's that going to mean for the future of people to try to comprehend or understand this, you know? So I just bring this point. Again, there's no, it is true that Prabhupada had an amazing way with words. There's no doubt about it. It is true that Prabhupada had a single voice and a single understanding when he presented all of his teachings. Maybe Krishna will make it a miracle and English language won't change for the next 10,000 years, and the books can say exactly identical, word for word, the way they are now. But probably things will go on the way they usually do, that languages change and people have to update languages because even words don't mean the same thing. Some 100 or 200 years ago, the word awful meant wonderful, because awful comes from the word awe, inspiring awe, full meaning full of awe, that something is wonderful. Now awful means terrible. So there's lots of words like that that actually change their whole meaning over years as it goes by. And these are small things, but eventually they add up. And then as we progress in our devotional march forward as a movement, we have to understand what our philosophy really is, not just lock in words. We have to understand what we're actually talking about and know when those words still accurately portray what the real meaning is, and when those words have now either become so obscure that nobody knows what they mean, or these words have gotten to the point where they may even give us the wrong impression, or worse yet, mean nothing to us at all, because there's no, I mean, 100 or 300 years from now, who's even going to know what a hippie was, you know, you know, be some kind of footnote in history that maybe if you were an astute historical scholar, you would know what it means. But otherwise, what does it mean? You know, Prabhupada said, I made hippies into happies. It's a phrase that may mean nothing as time goes on. Maybe the knowledge will continue about that. But the only point that I want to make, and the point that I keep coming back to, is we're not going to be saved by putting Prabhupada's books in a museum. We're going to be saved by understanding Prabhupada's books and being able to apply them and understand how they work together, because there is a Siddhanta, there is a common thread through all of the books. And as Prabhupada describes them and he explains them, he did so in a singular way. And some people will start taking the previous acharyas and reinterpreting Prabhupada through the eyes of previous acharyas, rather than taking the previous acharyas and interpreting through the eyes of Prabhupada, which is a different thing. You know, Prabhupada helped us to understand what the previous acharyas were saying. And he gave us everything that we need, but we have to put it in a perspective, and that's why it's incumbent on each one of us to try to understand this philosophy, not just to be able to parrot it, but to understand it, to understand when we've grasped it, when we haven't. Okay, so I've gone way over time.
One quick question?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the class.
Okay.
Really nice point at the end as well. So I was wondering, especially about your point, you're talking about different ways to categorize or describe Krishna consciousness, different ways to describe progress in Krishna consciousness. And you're mentioning this idea of the Bhuta, the Brahma Bhuta platform, which is in a lot of Prabhupada's writings.
Right.
You know, in Gita chapter 6, a lot of purports about what the Brahma Bhuta platform is. And I'm wondering if you can relate that to another kind of way that we categorize bhakti, like in Madhurya Kadambini or Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, this idea of like, you know, Shraddha, Bhajana Kriya, Anartha Nivritti,
Right,
Nishta, Ruchi, Ashakti.
Those are stages of purification,
So
right?
How do those stages correlate with coming to the Brahma Bhuta platform? I mean, it's not something that happens all at once. I mean, it doesn't seem like anything happens all at once, but that someone suddenly becomes Brahma Bhuta, or that Brahma Bhuta is a gradual cultivation, and also how does that correlate to being like, is it till you get to Nishta that you become Brahma Bhuta, or how does that correlate to your service? That's kind of my question.
Well, the way that Prabhupada describes Brahma Bhuta platform in Bhagavad Gita seems to indicate basically that if a person, you know, is engaged in devotional service, unfailing in all circumstances, he at once transcends the three modes of nature and comes to the level of Brahman, which is usually described as Brahma Bhuta. So, to the degree and to the extent, and as long as we are engaged in Krishna consciousness without distraction or anything else, we are on the Brahma Bhuta platform immediately. But unfortunately, we don't stay there. We vacillate back and forth between being Krishna conscious to some extent and being materially conscious to some extent. So we go back and forth. So therefore, we are not solidly on the Brahma Bhuta platform. But these 9 stages of bhakti, which are described in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, are gradual. As we see, Nishta is one of the stages. What does Nishta mean? It means steadiness. So at some point, we become steady. And when we become steady, then we are sort of situated on the Brahma Bhuta platform more or less permanently, you know. But before that point, we are sometimes on the Brahma Bhuta platform and sometimes not. Whereas people who are in normal material life are never on the Brahma Bhuta platform. They're always nasokshati, nakankshati. They're always hankering and lamenting, you know. They're always off the Brahma Bhuta platform.
So someone could be doing service, but experientially, are they on the, experientially there has to be something there. There's Brahma Bhuta platform. Some kind of realization has to be there.
Mm-hmm.
So one could be doing service and not be Brahma Bhuta, and one can be doing service and be Brahma Bhuta. Has to do with our realization of the service? What is the situation?
Well, the problem is that devotional service is always pure, but we are not. And that means we do what's known as mixed devotional service. And later on, Kapila Dev, in this chapter, not this chapter, but in this canto, will describe that devotional service can be done in the mode of goodness, passion, and ignorance. So that means, although we're performing devotional service, our method and our motivation is not pure. So it's still purifying, but it's not pure devotional service. So therefore, we don't get all the benefits of pure devotional service. We get some of the benefits of pure devotional service. Does that make sense or not? Or is that answering your question, or I'm in a different category, answering the wrong question?
I mean, we're 10 minutes over. Maybe I could talk about it with you after the class, because actually it might be kind of an extensive.
Okay, yeah. I don't want to keep everybody from prasadam. But thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Śrimad Bhāgavatam. All glories to the Vaishnava devotees. Hare Krishna.